Alrighty, so a couple of times now I've promised you short videos. I don't know if I've always delivered. Profs, once they start talking, it's hard to get them to shut up. Once you start me up, we never stop. But this one will be a short one. I guarantee it. I'm challenging myself. So this is just sort of part, again, just to kind of position this in the chapter of that structuralism versus functionalism, chapter 8. So we began with Titchener kind of defining his structuralist approach. We then talked about some intelligence research and how it was quite different. I don't know if I really made that point all that clearly, but the points I should have made about the intelligence one is that it obviously was an example of an applied use of psychology, so to try to help the school system improve. And that's the sort of theme we're going to follow up. So this lecture, taking care of business, is going to discuss some of psychology's connection to the business world, a connection which remains very strong today. In fact, if you look at a lot of the faculty in the management section at UTSC, many of them are psychology trained. They are psychology students that went into management, or a lot of them go into human resources and marketing, all sorts of things. So there are a lot of connections today between psychology and business. Where did they begin? So the chapter begins by talking about two individuals, and let me give them credit. I should at least say their names because I'm not going to highlight them here so much. But those two individuals were Munsterberg and Scott. And these were two early psychologists, in Munsterberg's case, literally trained by Wundt as well. But when they came back to America, they talked about psychology in a wide range of contexts. So Munsterberg really talked about how psychology could be relevant to a bunch of areas, including business. Scott kind of took the intelligence testing notion and brought it into the business and gave them some tests for employees. Now, these are very common today. Very often if you were interviewed for a job, they will give you tests to assess your fit with the job and your personality, etc. So Scott was the one that kind of started that industry. So those were the two that really kind of kicked it off. But the textbook then focuses on two other individuals, and those are the two we're going to focus on here too, because basically this is a reading club, right? So Frederick Taylor. The first thing I threw that little thing in the bottom right corner here because I really want to emphasize, how American this sort of is. That in the Wundt kind of tradition of Europe, the scientist was in the lab doing the kind of lab stuff, right? And of course that got brought over to America, but as it got brought over to America, America is the land of capitalism, right? Is the land where anybody can become a millionaire if you do the right things. And so that, quest for money, quest for riches, that capitalist mentality is a core part of America. And it shouldn't be surprising that we see psychology kind of connect with that sort of capitalist world. And so Frederick Taylor is one of the people we'll emphasize in this way, because what Taylor did is he basically brought a scientific analysis to the very common part of business in that day, which was assembly, creating things. In the case, in some of these cases, we're talking about the best thing to imagine is like a factory with, this is when Ford was creating cars using what's the assembly lines? Assembly line isn't quite right. I'm blocking on a word in my head. But basically, workers would have to build things or load things or create things. So a lot of human labor and a lot of sort of repetitive human behavior. So somebody would be doing, the same sort of thing over and over again. And what Taylor did is he went into some of these situations, and it talks about one which was sort of an iron mill where they produced these big iron bars that had to be loaded through the day. And the more bars that could be loaded, the more money the company would make. And so Taylor went and watched workers engaging in this. And what he found was that their movements were not very efficient. They were doing all sorts of bodily motions that were wasted time, wasted energy. And he went in and scientifically analyzed the requirements of each job and basically came up with the most efficient way of moving to accomplishing the goal, and then training employees to move that way, and not just move that way, but he also figured out the best amount of rest times to how much time should a person rest, how long should they rest each time. And so he ultimately would configure a set of instructions for a worker, and would say, this is the way we want you to do this task from now on, because if you do it this way, you're going to be able to load more of these steel pigs, they call them, in less time. Okay, so here's a graphic to kind of display some of this. So it's his scientific approach to business, and basically he said, so first of all, you don't allow somebody to say, hey, here's the way we do this because we've always done it this way, or this seems like a good idea to me. No, you let science, you let the science, in his case almost kinesiology, the science of body movements, tell you the best way to do something, and you use science to determine the best times to rest and all this kind of stuff. So it's very data driven, we would call it today. And then once you figured out the most efficient way of accomplishing that task, now you have to train the workers on how to do it in that way. And to the extent you can, you divide the work that has to be done between managers and workers, and you pay based on results. Let me highlight this pay based on results, because there's parts of this chapter that I think are very kind of interesting, just for the mentality that's there. What he would basically say is, if we paid somebody per unit that they load, now if we can show them a more efficient way to load, they will follow. They will be there because they can load more and they can make more money. And he thought that was critical. You have to incentivize the employee to want to increase their output. And so they have to get more money in order to do it. Of course, the company will get more money as well, because it's able to get more of this stuff loaded. But assuming there's just some maximum number of bars, in this case, that the company can produce, what will ultimately happen is we will get some employees that are really good at this, and we're going to pay them quite heavily, and they're going to be able to load a lot more, which means we don't need as many employees overall. We can have a smaller group of highly efficient employees getting paid more money to do the same task. And Taylor thought this was a good position to land on, a good place to be, which kind of showed, because he thought, that quest for money, that quest for success, that capitalist philosophy, is what will make this all work. And yes, it means we're going to have fewer employees, so we're going to lay off people or not give them a job. But at that time, they thought of that as sort of a social welfare thing. It's not our problem to make sure everybody has some money. What America is about is rewarding those who work hard. And so that was the kind of philosophy that Taylor was fitting into. He was showing companies how to reduce their employee load by creating more efficient work processes. All very movement-based, kind of interesting. Part of that movement-based thing, by the way, is at this time, it's kind of sort of a neat side story, they were starting to perfect what we now call stop-motion photography, where you could literally watch, in this case, a horse as they're running and see, his front leg bent, and then his front leg straightens out and reaches out a little further, and eventually, it's hard to sometimes see which leg we're looking at. I assume this is the outer one. Eventually strikes the ground, and then eventually lifts up, and etc. Whatever. So you could really see things now, see details of movement that you can't see with the naked eye. They're too fast for the naked eye. But on the stop motion, you can see it clearly. And so this technology was starting to be available. And this allowed people who were looking at motion and wanted to optimize motion to actually see it at this micro level. So the textbook will talk a little bit about that too. Okay, so that's Taylor. All right, let's move on from Taylor to perhaps the other major figure, which is Elton Mayo. You've probably heard of the Hawthorne effect. And some people think the Hawthorne effect and the placebo effect are the same thing. I'll tell you why they're not in a moment. But let's first get what the Hawthorne effect is. And so this was a time, again, when people were interested in productivity of factories. And they were manipulating things in a factory context to see, for example, did workers produce more output when there was more light in the room or less light in the room? Or what about music or not music? Or what about fresh air? Do you need fresh air or do you not need fresh air? Are windows important or not? These are questions people still ask all the time, but they started asking them at around this time. And the text was kind of confusing when it talks about it, because it seems to say at first that they varied lighting conditions for one group, but not for another, and that there was no effect of it. Okay. But then they go on and say everything you do produces an effect. So I'm confused, honestly. I'm confused about that first part. I believe the rest of the part. So that part where they say they varied something and there was no effect, I'm not quite sure. So if that confuses you, I think you're right to be confused. Here's how I would describe it. When they subsequently really got into, observing things, what they found is you can change things. You can change the lighting in a place. You can change the number of breaks. You can do all sorts of things. Almost no matter what you do, productivity increases. Almost any change increases productivity if that change and productivity are being monitored, right? So ultimately, people thought this is what the Hawthorne effect really is. When people are being watched, when they're being observed, they work harder, which doesn't sound so earth-shattering, so to speak. But it turns out it's a pretty large effect and therefore worthy of paying attention to. So when the workers knew the scientists were there and measuring things and manipulating things, it didn't really matter what they manipulated. It didn't really matter what they measured. Just the fact that they were being watched made them work harder. And so productivity increased. Okay, so we now call that the Hawthorne effect. When people are being observed, they tend to work harder. But there's actually a second part of the Hawthorne effect, and it's the one that this slide emphasizes. When Mayo also decided to chat with all the workers and to kind of interview them. And there's a very important line there that I want you guys to all get, because it's going to come back in different ways. He suggested he took part in something called active listening. So when he was sitting down with the employees, what you can do is just tell them fill out a questionnaire, right? Or you could go through the questionnaire and ask each question one at a time and write down what they answered. What Mayo noticed is that every now and then employees seem to just want to talk about some issue related to the work environment. And rather than saying, that's not what I'm asking you about now, or we'll get to that question later on, he made a point of talking about the fact that he would engage in active listening. He really made a point to say, tell me more about that. Let me hear that. Why does that concern you? Why is it a problem, etc.? And one of the things he found is just exactly this. When the workers realized that the employers cared about these things, when they were listening and they cared about them, then their productivity went even higher. And so this idea of, hey, if we can all, have a sort of team spirit and we're trying to do this together and we care about each other as we go through this, that produces a very high level of productivity as well. So that, usually when people talk about the Hawthorne, they say it's being observed. But it's this other point as well. Let me quickly compare the Hawthorne to the placebo, because I told you I would do that. So a placebo effect is when you give somebody something and you lead them to expect it will have a certain effect. And like this drug will do the following thing to you. It's going to make you really tired. And if you give people that, maybe it's just a sugar pill, which should actually make them wired more than tired. But if they believe it will make them tired, then it often does. So a placebo effect is more like if somebody puts you in some situation or in some condition and leads you to believe that something will happen, very often it does happen. It's basically borne out. The Hawthorne effect is just more general. When you watch people, they work harder. Okay, so it's a slightly different. So let me bring the two of these together. Let's say we have a weight loss study and we have 3 conditions. We have a drug we think will help people lose weight, but we actually have 3 conditions. So one condition, we're going to give these people the drug. The second condition, we're going to give them a placebo, but we're going to make them think we're giving them the drug. And the third condition, we're going to tell them, we're not ready to give you anything yet, but we want you to be measuring your weight, so that when we do give you something, then we'll have a tracking of where your weight was at the time. So we'd like you to keep measuring these weights. Okay. What will you see with these 3 groups? Well, you'll most likely see that all three will lose weight. Even this group we're not giving any drug to. This is the Hawthorne group. Okay, so this group, they know you're watching their weight, right? They're recording their weight, and so they know that's being watched, and that alone will tend to make them increase their performance, which in this case is like eat the right foods, stay away from the junk foods, etc. Maybe exercise more. And so they will lose weight even though we're not doing anything with them. We're just watching them. We're just recording their weight. Okay. Now these other two groups will probably lose weight more because they expect to. Okay. Both the placebo and the real drug think they're going to take something that will help them lose weight. So they may even lose additional weight. So this group may lose weight because of the Hawthorne effect, because they're being watched, and because of the placebo effect, because they think this drug will help them lose weight. And now, so these are really both control groups of a sort. And then we have this one, and we basically say, okay, over and above the Hawthorne effect and the placebo effect, are we seeing any additional weight loss that can really be attributed to the drug? Okay, so that's why all these three things kind of come important, and I hope that helps with that. All right, cool. The last thing I want to say in this part, yes, I'm to the last thing already, is just to highlight, this is literally the last thing they say in the textbook on this part before getting to the comparative psychology part. But I think it's important because I agree with exactly what they say. What we're seeing here is two individuals coming at a similar problem, increasing productivity in the workplace, but they're coming at it from very different perspectives. Taylor is very focused on the individual and the bodily movements of the individual. So almost a very reductionist, right? We're getting down to the core element of the task. Whereas Mayo ultimately focused on that, it says interpersonal relationships here, the relationship between the employee and the employer, and that sense of caring. And so, which is a much higher level thing than bodily movements, right? And he argued that, when the employee thinks the employer cares, then you get much higher productivity. So very different sort of levels of analysis from bodily movements to some perception of caring. And we're going to see this as a sort of theme that will come through in different situations where people are looking at the effects at different levels of the system. So these differences are not peculiar to industrial psychology. They represent fundamental differences in orientation that reveal themselves again and again in the work of people we will talk about. So I just wanted to highlight that because I think we're going to be calling back to this now and then. So I just want to make sure that's clear. That is it. That is my lecture on taking care of business. So I hope that's cool, and I will see you for one more quick lecture for Chapter 8. So 4 lectures for Chapter 8 total, and then we'll move on from there. Cool. Later.